The limp was the first thing he noticed. Dr. Caldwell watched from the nurse's station as Katie Morrison moved through the ICU corridor at 2:13 a.m., her left leg dragging almost imperceptibly with each step. Just a break in the rhythm. Just enough. He made a mental note in the way surgeons do, cataloging weakness like a predator identifies injury in a herd. The night shift stretched ahead of her, fluorescent lights buzzing their mechanical drone overhead, and she gripped the edge of the station counter as she passed, the gesture casual enough that no one else would see it as anything but fatigue. He didn't see the shrapnel. Didn't see the 2 pieces still lodged near her spine, souvenirs from an IED strike in Kandahar that had ended one career and forced the beginning of another. Didn't see the surgical scar that ran like a railroad track down her lumbar spine, visible only if she bent forward without her scrubs. Didn't know that the limp wasn't weakness, it was damage sustained while pulling 3 Marines out of a burning Humvee while her own blood pooled on desert sand at 127 degrees Fahrenheit. Katie Morrison, night shift ICU nurse at Seattle General in Portland, kept her head down and did her rounds. She moved through room 407 with the kind of efficiency that came from muscle memory and necessity. Colonel James Hendricks lay in the ICU bed, post-op day 1 following emergency cardiac surgery, his chest wrapped in sterile dressings and his oxygen saturation reading 96% on the monitor above his head. Air Force, 30 years of service, the kind of officer who'd been briefed on classified operations Katie had never heard of. His monitor beeped its steady rhythm, a metronome of healing. She adjusted his for with hands that had learned to find veins in pitch darkness, hands that knew exactly how much pressure a needle needed before it breached the vein wall. The antiseptic smell of the ICU wrapped around her like a familiar second skin, that chemical sharpness that came from 7 a.m. sanitization cycles and 3 a.m. fear. She knew who he was. Not from any official briefing. Not from the chart clip to the foot of his bed. She knew because her son Derek had talked about him exactly once, 6 years ago, sitting on her porch with a beer he was technically too young to drink, his flight suit draped over the railing. Derek had said Caldwell, no, wrong name. Derek had said Colonel Hendricks was the kind of commander who'd carry a wounded Marine out of a firefight himself if it came down to it. The kind of man who didn't leave people behind. The kind of man Derek had wanted to be. Katie's hand moved to her sternum without thinking, pressing against the fabric of her scrubs where the dog tag hung on a broken chain beneath. Derek's dog tag. The one he'd pressed into her hand the night before his last deployment to Helmand Province, the mission from which he never returned. The metal was cold now, cold enough to burn against her skin. "How are you feeling, Colonel?" Her voice came out steady. Professional. The voice of a night shift nurse asking the question she'd asked 10,000 times before. Colonel Hendricks opened his eyes. They were the same grey-blue as the men in her unit used to be, soldiers who'd learned to see too much and stay silent about it. "Like I got hit by a truck, nurse. But I've had worse." He lifted his head slightly. You were there. In Kandahar. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines." The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator in the adjacent room whooshing its mechanical rhythm. Katie's jaw clenched for a single heartbeat. Just one. Then she was professional again, checking his dressing, making notes on the chart, moving as if the question had never landed. "Your vitals are excellent, Colonel. Surgeon would be pleased. Your ejection fraction is recovering beautifully." "You were there," he said again. Not a question this time. Stable on current medications, Katie continued, her voice dropping into that particular register that nurses used when they had decided a conversation was finished. "I'll check on you in 2 hours. Call if you need anything." She turned toward the door, but Colonel Hendricks wasn't the kind of officer who accepted evasion. "What's your name, nurse?" She paused. Just barely. Just long enough for him to see it. "Morrison. Major Katie Morrison. ICU night shift." The name hung in the air between them like a live wire. Dr. Caldwell heard the exchange from the nurse's station. He was reviewing discharge paperwork for the cardiac patient 2 rooms down, a routine administrative task, when he caught the fragment of conversation drifting through the open doorway. Major. The word registered. It shouldn't have. Night shift ICU nurses at Seattle General didn't use military titles. Didn't introduce themselves with rank. He made another mental note. Inappropriate. Emotional. A nurse creating false intimacy with a patient, probably some fantasy she carried about her own military history. He'd seen it before, people who'd served, who'd suffered, who couldn't seem to separate their past from their present. Liability. Caldwell used the word in his mind the way other men might use it in a courtroom. A liability was something you managed. Something you prepared to remove. Katie finished her rounds at 3:15 a.m. Room 407 would require vital sign checks every 4 hours, standard post-op protocol. Colonel Hendricks' surgical wound was clean, his oxygen saturation steady, his heart rate comfortably in the 70s. Everything looked textbook perfect. But Katie knew better than to trust textbook perfect. She'd spent 18 months in field hospitals in Kandahar, the kind of places where textbook protocol didn't exist. She'd performed emergency field thoracotomy with a combat knife on Lance Corporal Mitchell Chen, cracking his sternum to reach the perforated artery that no textbook had prepared her for. Mitchell had survived. Mitchell had made it home. She had a Christmas card from him every year, from his wife, from their daughter who was 7 now and loved to draw pictures of helicopters. Colonel Hendricks' discharge paperwork was already flagged for day 2 of hospitalization. Early, but not unprecedented. The ICU bed was valuable real estate. Caldwell had mentioned something about a donor case coming in, a high-priority admission that needed the best room, the best monitoring. Katie had seen it before. Hospital economics. The heartless mathematics of resource allocation. Except Colonel Hendricks wasn't ready. She could feel it in the way he breathed, the slight catch when he inhaled past the surgical pain, the way his eyes tracked her movements with the hypervigilance of a man who'd been in combat situations. Post-op day 1. The critical window. Cardiac patients could compensate beautifully on day 1, the adrenaline kept them stable, and then crater on day 2 when the body's reserves emptied. She'd seen it happen. Had held the hands of families who'd watched their loved ones go from stable to coding in the span of a single morning. She touched the dog tag again as she charted her notes, the metal warming now against her chest. Derek's name on that steel. Derek who'd been under Colonel Hendricks' command. Derek who'd trusted this man. At 4:22 a.m., Katie was in the medication room restocking the 14-gauge angiocath needles when Dr. Caldwell found her. He leaned against the doorframe, his white coat still pristine despite the hour, his eyes carrying the glint of a man who'd just discovered something useful. "That patient in 407, he said. Not a greeting. Not a question. "Colonel Hendricks." Katie didn't look up from the supply cart. "Yes, doctor." "You know him." It wasn't a question. She answered it anyway. "He served with my son. A long time ago." The silence that followed was the kind of silence that hunters learn to recognize. The moment before something lunged. "That's the kind of attachment that compromises medical judgment," Caldwell said. His voice was smooth, conversational. "I've already written the discharge order for day 2. Early, but the patient is stable. We need the bed." Katie turned to face him. Just that. Turned. Didn't step closer. Didn't step away. Post-op day 1 cardiac patients need monitoring. 48 hours minimum. "I'm aware of the protocol, nurse." "Then you know the risk." Caldwell smiled. It was the kind of smile that didn't include his eyes. "I know my patient. He'll be fine. We'll reassess in the morning, and if his vitals hold, he goes to step-down care." He paused. Let the weight of certainty settle in the room like a physical presence. "Unless you think your emotional investment is more reliable than my medical judgment." The room suddenly felt smaller. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed to buzz louder, more insistent. Katie's hand was still on the supply cart, her fingers around the box of needles, and she made herself release it slowly. Made herself stand straight, made herself look at him directly, made herself meet the challenge in his eyes without flinching. His ejection fraction is 40%, Katie said. Her voice had changed. Dropped. Become something sharper. Standard recovery requires 48 to 72 hours before step down. I documented the clinical concerns in his chart. Noted and overruled. Caldwell straightened, brushed an imaginary speck from his coat. Discharge paperwork stands. We're done here, Nurse Morrison. He left. Katie stood alone in the medication room, surrounded by sterile supplies and fluorescent light, her hand still raised where the supply cart had been. She thought about Colonel Hendricks. Thought about Derek. Thought about the dog tag burning against her skin like a promise that was about to be broken. The next words out of Caldwell's mouth, when he spoke them the next morning, would change everything. Dr. Caldwell entered room 407 like a man who owned the building. His white coat swished as he moved, expensive shoes clicking against linoleum, and he carried with him the kind of air that made rooms smaller. Colonel Hendricks' daughter and son-in-law stood at the bedside. Katie was adjusting the 4-pump when Caldwell's voice cut through the monitor's steady beeping. Nurse Morrison. Perhaps you'd like to explain to the Hendricks family why you're questioning my medical judgment. Katie turned, one hand still pressed to her abdomen where the old combat wound ached like a warning. The morning light through the hospital window cast everything in sharp relief. She met his gaze, pale blue, cold as winter concrete, and kept her voice level. Doctor, his cardiac enzymes are still elevated. Troponin at 0.8. His ejection fraction hasn't stabilized, and discharge in 2 days. Are you a cardiologist now, Morrison? Caldwell's smile was the kind that predators wear. Or just a floor nurse with delusions of competence. The daughter looked away. The son-in-law studied his shoes. Caldwell turned to them, his voice dropping into something that sounded almost sympathetic, the kind of false concern that made Katie's skin crawl. I apologize for Nurse Morrison's emotional involvement with your father's case. It's inappropriate. Frankly, unprofessional. She seems to have developed an attachment that clouds her judgment. These things happen with nurses who've been in one place too long. Katie felt something shift inside her chest, not fear, not anger. Clarity. The kind of clarity that came from seeing a situation with absolute precision. She took one measured breath. The tear that escaped was involuntary, a purely physical response to the shrapnel still lodged near her spine, to the weight of Derek's dog tag beneath her scrubs. She wiped it with the back of her hand without breaking eye contact with Caldwell. Her voice came out steady, quiet enough that only he really heard it. Colonel Hendricks served 30 years, so men like you could play politics with hospital beds. I hope you sleep well tonight, Doctor. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Caldwell's face shifted, the smile vanished, replaced by something harder. He pointed toward the door. You're dismissed from this case. Effective immediately. Katie left without another word. Behind her, she heard the colonel's voice calling her name, but Caldwell was already speaking over him, his tone suddenly warm again, all apologies to the family about the instability of the nursing staff. The next day came like a punishment. Katie entered the staff break room at 11 a.m. with her lunch in a paper bag, turkey sandwich, an apple, black coffee in a dented thermos. 8 nurses were seated at 2 tables, mid-conversation. Laughter died the moment she walked through the door. One of them, Janet from Nights, looked at her. Then at the others. One by one, they gathered their food. No one spoke. They just left, their shoes squeaking against the tile floor in a kind of synchronized exodus that felt choreographed. Katie sat at the empty table under flickering fluorescent lights that buzzed like angry wasps. She stared at her untouched sandwich. Through the open doorway, she heard their voices in the corridor. Caldwell says she's unstable, combat issues, can't follow orders, inappropriate attachments. She found the dog tag with her fingers, felt the cold weight of it beneath her scrubs, and waited for her shift to end. But that wasn't the worst part. The shift after that, Katie arrived early to check the staff bulletin board. New postings were always there, scheduling updates, patient safety alerts, continuing education reminders. This one had her name centered at the top in red marker, printed in capital letters like a scarlet letter. Morrison, K. Insubordination, emotional instability, inappropriate patient attachment, final warning. She read it once. Twice. 15 staff members walked past her as she stood there, each one slowing down, reading the words, then accelerating past without meeting her eyes. The humiliation was methodical. Calculated. Caldwell had weaponized the bulletin board the way a surgeon uses a scalpel, with precision and complete understanding of where the wound would cut deepest. His voice came from behind her, close enough that she could smell the expensive cologne beneath the hospital antiseptic. Effective immediately, you're reassigned to morgue rotation, Morrison. Overnight. Alone. Maybe the dead won't trigger your... He paused, letting the suggestion hang. Issues. Katie turned to face him. His smirk was the smile of a man who believed he'd already won. She found the dog tag with her fingers and held his gaze with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst a firefight could offer. I hope you sleep well tonight, Doctor, she said again, identical inflection, identical restraint. Caldwell's smirk widened. I always do. He walked away before she could respond, his footsteps echoing down the corridor like a countdown. That night, Katie was assigned to the morgue basement, the sub-level unit where bodies awaited transfer, where the fluorescent lights hummed a different frequency, where the temperature stayed perpetually cold. She signed in at 11 p.m. The morgue attendant, Marcus Chen, a Marine veteran with 17 years of service behind him, looked at her uniform and said nothing. He didn't need to. Everyone knew what the red marker write-up meant. Everyone knew Caldwell was cutting her loose. At 2 a.m., Katie couldn't stay down there anymore. The morgue felt like a grave too early. She climbed the stairs back to the ICU, badge still active, still valid, still hers. The night shift was minimal, one nurse covering 12 beds, the senior resident sleeping in the on-call room. She moved through the corridor without sound. Room 407 was dark except for the ambient glow of the monitors. Colonel Hendricks was struggling to breathe. His call button lay on the floor. His chart, when Katie pulled it quietly from the slot, showed what she'd feared. Caldwell had ordered cardiac monitoring removed 6 hours ago. The notation read, encourage patient independence. Remove unnecessary alarms. Katie's jaw clenched. Independence was one thing. Abandonment was another. She reconnected the monitor leads with steady hands. The rhythm strip appeared on the screen, an immediate arrhythmia scrolled across the screen, atrial fibrillation with a heart rate of 127 and climbing. Blood pressure was dropping. 78/52. She had maybe 10 minutes before this became a full crash. She initiated rapid response on the overhead speaker, then moved to help the colonel sit up. His breathing eased slightly with the position change. His hand gripped her arm. You're Morrison, he said, voice thin as paper. Derek's mother. He showed me your picture before the final operation. Before the IED. Katie's throat tightened. The dog tag felt like it was burning against her skin. He spoke about you, Colonel, she said quietly. Said you carried him out of the firefight. I tried, Katie. I tried so hard to keep him with me. Those words would replay in her mind for years. But the present demanded action. Katie helped him to the bathroom, slow, careful steps, her hand under his elbow, supporting his weight. The room was small, the tile cool under the soles of her shoes. She was helping him sit when the door opened. 2 men in street clothes. Faces obscured by surgical masks. Pistols held low, professional, the way men who knew guns carried them. Colonel Hendricks, the lead man, said, You're coming with us. The testimony about Kandahar contracts. You're going to recant it. Katie's training ignited before thought could catch up. Muscle memory was a living thing inside her. she positioned herself between the colonel and the guns. Hands up, palms forward, voice calm and measured. "He's a cardiac patient. He can't go anywhere." The lead man's finger moved toward the trigger. "Then he dies here," he said. The morgue rotation paperwork sat on Katie's locker shelf like a death sentence. Effective immediately. Swing shift reassigned. Night ICU access revoked. She read Caldwell's note 3 times, her jaw tight, her hand steady despite the tremor threatening to surface somewhere deep in her chest. 2 days. 48 hours since he'd dressed her down in front of the colonel's family, and now this, the strategic kill, the thing that would break her if she let it. She understood what he was doing. This wasn't anger. Anger would be loud. This was calculated. Remove her from the floor where patients recognized her competence, where her clinical instincts carried weight, where she could advocate and question and push back. Stick her in the morgue where the dead didn't need her, where her expertise was worthless, where she'd spend 8 hours a night in silence and fluorescent silence and the smell of formaldehyde. He was killing her career in slow motion, and she could do nothing about it because she had no allies left in this hospital. The night shift supervisor had left the notice on the public board with red marker. Caldwell wanted it visible. Wanted the staff to see that Katie Morrison had been relegated to the basement. Wanted them to understand what happened when you questioned him. Katie closed her locker. The dog tag beneath her scrubs burned cold against her sternum, and she pressed her palm flat against her upper chest for 3 seconds, grounding herself. Derek's tag. The one he'd pressed into her hand before his last deployment, the one she'd never taken off even after the notification officers came to her apartment. Even after she'd left the Air Force. Even now, working night shift as an invisible nurse in a hospital where the chief of surgery had decided her presence was a liability. She had her final ICU assignment before the morgue rotation began. Tonight. 2300 to 0700. 8 hours to say goodbye to the patient she knew, to the work that mattered. After tonight, she was basement staff. At 1945 hours, Katie finished her pre-flight check on the unit. 2 post-surgical patients stable. 3 monitoring through the night. The colonel's room sat empty, his bed stripped and remade, monitors already reassigned. He'd been gone for 6 hours. Caldwell had gotten his bed back. Caldwell had his win. Katie tried not to think about whether the colonel was safe. At 2300, she clocked in. The night supervisor didn't acknowledge her. Neither did the 3 nurses working the floor. They knew where she'd been reassigned. They knew what that meant. By 0200, Katie had finished her charting and her final rounds on her stable patients. The ICU hummed with its familiar nighttime rhythm, ventilators breathing, monitors beeping in their syncopated patterns, the distant sound of an elevator opening and closing somewhere deep in the hospital spine. The fluorescent lights cast everything in the same pale, shadowless glow. She told herself to go home when her shift ended. She told herself to pack her locker and walk away. Instead, at 0202 hours, Katie Morrison walked to the security stairwell and climbed back to the 3rd floor, where Dr. Caldwell's explicit orders had forbidden her to step. The dog tag clinked softly against her ribs as she moved, and her breathing stayed even, controlled, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. Colonel Hendrick's reassignment had bothered her since she'd read the discharge papers. His vital signs had been improving, yes, but the pattern was off. His oxygen saturation numbers had plateaued. His creatinine was trending upward. A man didn't recover from a cardiac event and abdominal trauma in 48 hours. Not in the real world. Not according to the protocols that kept people alive. But he'd been in Caldwell's way. Caldwell's donor patient needed the bed. Katie didn't have a rational reason for what she was about to do. Except that she did. She had 18 years of instinct. She had 3 tours of Kandahar where she'd learned to trust the part of her brain that screamed danger before she could see it. She had her son's commanding officer lying in a room somewhere, and Caldwell had ordered her to let him go. The ICU hallway was dim at 0200. She moved past the nurse's station, empty, thank God, and found his room at the far end of the corridor. Room 347. The door was slightly ajar. No monitors visible through the gap. She pushed it open. Colonel Hendricks lay in darkness, the bed rails down, his chest rising and falling slowly. Too slowly. Katie's hand was on his wrist before her brain caught up, checking his pulse, finding it thready and rapid, his skin cool and damp despite the ambient temperature. His foot stood empty, the bag depleted hours ago. She was about to reach for the call button when the door behind her burst open. Two men in street clothes came through without knocking, without announcing, without any of the protocols that governed entry into a hospital room. The first one had a SIG Sauer P226 leveled at Colonel Hendricks' chest, the muzzle steady as surgical steel. The second man positioned himself at the door, his hand on a Glock 19, eyes dark and professional. "Colonel Hendricks," the first man said, his voice the kind of flat that meant someone had killed before. "You're coming with us." Katie's hand dropped from the colonel's wrist. The dog tag beneath her scrubs went ice cold. "Stand back, nurse," the second man said, almost as an afterthought. He wasn't even looking at her. Just waving his free hand like she was furniture. Colonel Hendricks' eyes opened slowly, confusion registering across his face. His hand fumbled for the bed control, but his coordination was shot. "I don't know what." "Kandahar," the first man cut him off. His finger began to move toward the trigger. Not tentatively. With purpose. "The testimony you gave regarding contract fraud. That cost someone $400 million. You're going to help us understand where the documentation went." "I didn't," the colonel started. The finger tightened. Katie saw it. Saw the subtle muscle shift in the man's forearm, the minute rotation of the trigger guard. The kind of tell that most people missed because they'd never been trained to see it. She'd been trained. She'd spent 3 years learning to read a man's intent in the split second before he decided whether you lived or died. This man had decided. The colonel was going to die in this room. There was no thought after that. No calculation. No weighing of consequences or considering the protocols she'd just broken by returning to this floor against Caldwell's orders. Her body moved on 18 years of muscle memory that didn't care about hospital regulations or chain of command or the fact that she was a night shift nurse with 2 decades of combat medicine folded into her spine. She shoved Colonel Hendricks sideways off the bed, her hands finding his shoulders and driving him down and behind her in one fluid motion. Her body became the shield. Her torso became the target. The first shot tore through her right shoulder, spinning her clockwise, her scapula exploding into fragments that her brain registered as sharp red reports of pain. Not pain. Data. Pain is data. The shoulder was gone. She compensated, rotating with the momentum instead of against it. The second shot punched into her upper left chest, 2 inches below her collarbone. She felt the rib crack, felt the wind leave her lungs, felt something hot and wrong blossom beneath her sternum. Third shot followed almost immediately, the shooter double tapping, and it struck her low, just above her left breast, and she felt the bullet tunnel through her left lung and exit through the wall behind her, leaving a hole the size of a dime in the drywall. Her spine hit the wall. She was falling now, her legs no longer accepting commands. The fourth bullet came as she was sliding down, and it caught her in the abdomen, just above her hip, tearing through intestine and muscle and the kind of vital real estate that people didn't walk away from. Her vision spiraled. Her hands tried to press against her stomach, but there was too much, too many wounds, too much happening too fast. The fifth shot found her right hip joint, shattered the femoral head, sent a jolt of pain so profound that her vision went white, then red, then dark at the edges. She collapsed fully now, her body a heap on the cold tile floor, her blood spreading in a dark pool that caught the hallway light. The colonel was behind her, alive, his hand reaching out and shaking as he fumbled for the emergency call button mounted beside his bed. His finger found it. The alarms shrieked. One continuous scream of notification, and Katie heard boots, heard running, heard voices shouting code blue, heard the second gunman curse and the first gunman already moving toward the window, already understanding that their window had closed. 30 seconds. That was all the colonel's life had bought him. 30 seconds before hospital security was flooding into the hallway, before the gunmen were abandoning their mission and running. The second man fired once at the approaching security team, suppressing fire, no real aim, and then they were gone, boots pounding down the stairwell. Their plan dissolved into chaos because Colonel Hendricks was alive and breathing and pressing an emergency button while Katie Morrison died on the floor. Dr. Caldwell arrived 40 seconds later. He stood in the doorway, surveying the scene, Katie bleeding out on bathroom tile, her dog tag glinting beneath the fluorescent lights where it had worked free of her scrubs during the fall. The colonel on the floor, shaking but alive. Bullet holes in the walls. The window still open. The emergency call button, still activated. His face purpled. She violated my explicit order, Caldwell screamed at the two nurses now appearing in the hallway. She was banned from this floor. She was reassigned. This is her fault, this violence, this chaos, this unauthorized presence. She brought this into MY Hospital. Katie's vision tunneled. The pain had become white noise, and all she could hear was her own breathing, each inhalation wet and difficult, each exhalation tasting like copper. Her hands were slick with blood. She couldn't stop the bleeding. She tried, pressing her palms against her chest, her stomach, her hip, but there were 5 wounds and 2 hands and the math wasn't working. She's fired, Caldwell continued, his voice rising. Effective immediately. Do you hear me, Morrison? Fired. Security, get her off my floor. The trauma team burst through the stairwell doors, bags, and equipment, and Caldwell stepped toward them, his authority intact. Dr. Chen is expecting me in OR 3 for the donor patient. She's a perfect 5-organ candidate. Take your surgical team to the OR. Leave Morrison with a first-year resident for stabilization. The trauma surgeon, Dr. Reeves, a woman with 30 years of experience, stopped. Sir, she's got 5 GSWs, she needs the full team, she needs to learn the consequences of insubordination, Caldwell said. His voice had gone cold. His eyes were on Katie's blood-soaked form on the floor. First-year resident Harper will manage her. You have a patient who actually deserves your attention. There was a pause. One moment where Dr. Reeves looked at Katie, looked at Caldwell, understood the choice being made and the fact that her career would end if she refused. She picked up her trauma bag. She turned toward OR 3. Caldwell followed her, already talking about reperfusion times, already focused on the patient who could give him another commendation, another publication, another line on his CV. A terrified first-year resident named Harper, a woman who'd been in this hospital for 6 weeks, knelt beside Katie with shaking hands. Harper's gloves were trembling. Her voice was trembling. Everything about her was trembling except her competence, which was simply not yet formed. Katie's eyes flickered closed. The dog tag, still clutched in her blood-soaked fist, burned cold against her palm. The last thing she heard before the darkness took her was Caldwell's voice, already distant, already forgotten, already turning his attention to the patient who mattered. The patient whose bed had been worth 5 bullets. The patient whose life had been bought with her body. The alarms continued to scream. 3 days later, the fluorescent ceiling tiles came into focus 1 pixel at a time. Katie's eyes tracked the acoustic holes, counting them like sheep, each one a small mercy that meant she was still capable of counting. Her shoulder screamed. Her chest throbbed in 4 separate places where surgeons had gone deep. The drains, she could feel them before she saw them, pulled fluid from cavities that shouldn't exist in a human body. This was what 5 bullets looked like on the inside. The monitors beside her bed beeped in a rhythm she recognized from 1,000 other patient rooms. Heart rate 89. Oxygen saturation 94 on 2 liters nasal cannula. Blood pressure 118/72, not great for someone who'd lost nearly 40% of her circulating blood volume, but stable. Pain is data, she'd always taught the residents. Her pain said she was alive. Her pain said the surgeons had done their job, stitching arteries and muscle and whatever else they'd found bleeding into her abdomen. A man she'd never seen before stood at the foot of her bed. He was middle-aged, pressed suit despite the early morning, hospital administrator written across his posture like a neon sign. His shoes were polished. His tie was knotted at exactly the right angle. He carried a manila folder the way a priest carries communion. "Miss Morrison," he began, and Katie heard the word Morrison like a man reading a stranger's name off a clipboard. Not Katie. Not a person. A last name. A termination. "I need to inform you of some procedural matters regarding your employment status." Katie's voice came out as a rasp, 2 days of intubation having left her throat scarred from the endotracheal tube. "Colonel Hendricks. Stable. Recovering. You saved his life." The administrator opened the folder. The sound of paper separating was surprisingly loud in the recovery room. "Which is the only reason this conversation isn't worse. Your employment with Seattle General was terminated effective immediately upon admission to surgery 3 days ago." She'd known. Part of her had known before the second bullet hit. But knowing and hearing were different countries. "Your badge has been deactivated. Your personnel file has been flagged with a notation preventing rehire at any affiliated institution. Additionally, Dr. Caldwell has initiated contact with medical credentialing boards and human resources departments at Mercy General, Oregon Health and Science University Hospital, Providence, Legacy, and Adventist Medical Center. Those conversations included details about your termination for gross insubordination and violation of direct medical orders." Katie stared at the ceiling tiles. Counted them again. There were 47 in the visible grid. He called them all. Her voice was barely a whisper. 7 hospitals. Over 40 phone calls in 72 hours. The administrator's face was the color of drywall. "You're a hero, Ms. Morrison. You're also, as of right now, unemployable in the Pacific Northwest." The folder landed on her bed tray. Inside were her termination papers, already signed. Not dated that morning. Dated during her surgery. While Caldwell had pulled her trauma team to save his donor patient. While a first-year resident with shaking hands tried to manage 5 entry and exit wounds. The administrator left without another word. A nurse came by an hour later, not one of the usual rotation, someone from the 5th floor who didn't know Katie, who therefore wouldn't be contaminated by association. She checked the drains without looking at Katie's face, a kindness so profound it nearly broke something. "There's a nurse," the woman said quietly, adjusting the fall line, "one of the ER nurses. She said to tell you the security footage from that night." "From the ICU? It's been corrupted. Every clip where Dr. Caldwell came into your room. The system just malfunctioned. Someone in IT apparently filed a maintenance report about it." She paused. "Someone who's apparently a Marine." Katie closed her eyes. The 5th day came with rain hammering the parking lot like a war drum. Katie's body was still draining, yellowish fluid collecting in the hemovac bulb at her hip, the wound still angry red where the 4th bullet had shattered bone. Against medical advice, against the protestations of the resident covering her case, against every rational cell in her body, she signed the discharge papers. The resident was maybe 26, with the haunted look of someone who'd spent 3 nights remembering his hands shaking while he fought to save someone. "You're not ready," he said quietly, handing her the prescriptions. "You're going to tear something. You'll bleed out before you can get to an ER." "I know," Katie said. She dressed in the clothes they'd brought from home. Her scrubs had been incinerated. The jeans clung to her bandages. The t-shirt pulled at her shoulder. Every movement was an argument with her own body, pain that was data, pain that meant something, pain that meant she was still capable of feeling anything at all. The drive to Willamette National Cemetery took 17 minutes. The rain turned Portland into an impressionist painting, streetlights smearing gold across wet asphalt. Katie drove with her right hand only, her left arm strapped tight to her torso, and didn't once exceed 30 miles per hour. Section D. Row 42. The grass was mud. The headstone was wet granite, black with rain, and Derek Morrison's name was carved so deep you could lose your fingers in the letters. Captain, United States Air Force. 1987 to 2012, beloved son. Beloved husband. Beloved. Katie knelt in the mud. Her bandaged hands, still shaking from blood loss, from pain, from something her body was doing that her mind wasn't controlling, pulled the dog tag from her pocket. Single tag on a broken chain. The metal was ice cold, the way it always was when she took it out. She'd kept it against her skin for 7 years, pressed to her sternum beneath her scrubs, but this morning she'd moved it to her pocket. A distinction that mattered. A small surrender. I couldn't save you, she whispered. The rain hammered harder. I couldn't save you, Derek, and now I can't even save the man who tried to carry you out. Her voice didn't break. Breaking was something that happened to other people, people who had the luxury of fragility. I failed you. I failed him. I failed them all. The dog tag cut into her palm. She was squeezing it hard enough that the edges drew blood through the bandages. The old wound ached, shrapnel that still lived in her spine, that had ended her career the first time, that made her unsuitable for flying, for jumping, for anything but this, kneeling in mud, holding metal that had belonged to a dead man, whispering apologies to stone. Thunder rolled overhead like an artillery barrage. Katie stayed there for an hour while the rain soaked through her jeans, while the cold settled into her bones, while hypothermia began its slow crawl across her nervous system. A small voice in her head, the military voice, the training, the survival instinct, kept insisting she should move, find shelter, get warm. But the rest of her, the part that had been hollowed out by 5 bullets and a system that fed on its own destruction, couldn't remember why that mattered. Finally, when her teeth began to chatter hard enough to hurt her jaw, she forced herself to stand. The drive back to her apartment was made in a fugue state. She was aware of traffic. She was aware of the stoplight turning red. She was aware of her hands being completely numb on the steering wheel. But she was also somewhere else, somewhere very far away, somewhere that didn't require her to think about the future. Her apartment was the same as she'd left it. That was wrong somehow. Things should have changed. The walls should be different colors. The furniture should have rearranged itself. But no. The couch was still where it had been. The window still looked out on Portland's rain-soaked streets. The mailbox had not stopped its work, eviction notices were stacked on the counter alongside bills from the hospital, documents from the creditors, papers from every institution that she owed money to or space in their building to. The dog tag sat on the coffee table where she'd placed it that morning. She stared at it through the night, the only light coming from the neon signs outside bleeding through the curtains. She'd failed. The hospital was gone. The career was gone. The man who'd carried her son out of the desert was still breathing because she'd thrown her body in front of a bullet, but the system had punished her for that choice. That was the thing no one told you about heroism. That it ended exactly like failure. Somewhere around dawn, Katie fell asleep in the chair, still staring at the dog tag, still holding it in her bandaged hand, still unable to let go. 7 days. That was all it took for a life to collapse into envelopes stamped in red ink. Katie Morrison sat at her kitchen table in a third-floor apartment that no longer belonged to her, staring at the eviction notice for the 3rd time that morning. The date was circled. 14 days to vacate. The medical bills had consumed everything, her savings account, her emergency fund, the college fund she'd set aside for Derek before he enlisted. Before he died. Before she stopped being a soldier and started pretending to be invisible. The apartment smelled like stale coffee and desperation. Her bandages needed changing. She could feel the stitches pulling at her chest, a dull ache that traveled down her ribs like a geography lesson in pain. Pain is information. That's what they taught you in field medicine. This pain was telling her that she was unemployed, unemployable, and running out of time. She pressed her palm against the wound beneath her shirt and closed her eyes. The dog tag hung cold against her sternum, still on its broken chain. Derek's call sign was engraved on the back. She'd never told anyone it was there. The apartment windows faced east. 7 miles away, toward the industrial district where Seattle General sprawled across 12 city blocks, something moved in the sky. At first, Katie thought it was a weather pattern, a shadow, a cloud formation, something ordinary. But the sound came 3 seconds later. Helicopter rotors. Not one. Multiple. The sound was wrong, too synchronized, too military, moving with the precision of a formation flight. She stood. Her hips screamed. She walked to the window, pulled the curtain back. The Black Hawks descended through the morning haze like something from a war movie, their rotor wash visible as concentric ripples across the parking lots below. Their fuselages were painted in Air Force colors. The hospital was too far to see details, but not far enough to miss what was happening: for military insertion, a coordinated arrival, something big enough to move for helicopters through civilian airspace. Katie's hand found the window frame. She didn't know why. Her body knew something her brain hadn't processed yet. The helicopters landed in perfect formation. Even from this distance, she could count the seconds between touchdown and personnel deployment. 10 seconds. Professional. Military. Not law enforcement, not crisis response. This was a purpose-built operation. Inside Seattle General, the landing created exactly the kind of chaos that hospitals despise. Alarms. Confusion. The ER nurses checking windows while administrators scrambled to figure out why the Air Force had arrived without warning. Dr. Caldwell was on call. Everyone knew this because he made certain people remembered it, and he was currently in the doctor's lounge, reading something on his iPad that made him smile the way wolves smile. The security team came through the main entrance in formation. 12 personnel in dress blues, their boots striking the tile floor with mechanical precision. Not rifles. Dress uniform meant this wasn't tactical. This was ceremonial. Official. They moved through the hallway with the kind of authority that made administrators reconsider their career choices. One of them, a woman with major's insignia and eyes like a predator assessing prey, walked directly toward the administrative wing. The others fanned out, securing the facility with the casual competence of professionals who had done this in Kandahar, Mosul, and Fallujah. Dr. Caldwell heard the commotion and emerged from the doctor's lounge, irritation already forming his expression into something mean. Who authorized this? This is a medical facility, not a... He stopped. Colonel James Hendricks stood in the administrative hallway wearing a hospital gown and an 4-pole like they were weapons of war. His chest was bandaged, his face still carrying the paleness of someone who'd bled out less than a week ago, but his spine was straight and his eyes were clear and focused directly on the hospital's chief of surgery. "That nurse you fired," Colonel Hendricks said. His voice was a command, not an introduction. "That nurse is Major Katie Morrison, Bronze Star with Valor, Purple Heart, the surgeon who kept my entire unit alive for 18 months in Kandahar until an IED nearly killed her and ended her active service." The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum. Caldwell's face shifted through several emotions at once: confusion, dismissal, and then something darker. Understanding. The kind of understanding that arrives too late to matter. The hospital CEO, a woman named Patricia Vance who made 3 times Caldwell's salary, stepped forward with trembling hands carrying a manila folder. She opened it. Her eyes widened as she read. "Dr. Caldwell," she said quietly, "Major Morrison served as a combat field surgeon for 12 years. She completed 2 combat medical certifications. She holds a Bronze Star, which according to this citation, was awarded for direct heroism under fire while performing emergency field thoracotomy with a combat knife on a wounded Marine at FOB Shank in Logar Province." Patricia's voice cracked. She kept reading. "Purple Heart. 2 Purple Hearts. Shrapnel still embedded in her spinal column. She was medically retired with full honors." Caldwell's jaw worked silently. He was doing the math, recalculating everything he'd known, everything he thought he'd known, everything he'd said about her in the staff room. The major stepped forward. Her limp was visible but her presence filled the space like pressure. Dr. Caldwell, you told hospital staff I was emotionally involved with a patient. I was. His name is Colonel Hendricks. I knew him because he commanded my son. My son, Derek Morrison, was a fighter pilot. Colonel Hendricks brought him home. When Derek got sick, the colonel came to this hospital, and I wanted to make sure he received care from someone who understood what his life was worth. She stopped. She let that sit. That wasn't emotional involvement. That was honor. The Air Force Inspector General arrived exactly 53 minutes later, carrying briefcases and questions that landed like precision strikes. She explained that the assassination attempt against Colonel Hendricks was connected to testimony he'd provided regarding contract fraud in Kandahar, testimony that had cost someone billions in illegal weapons procurement and corporate kickback schemes. What the IG didn't need to explain was that Major Katie Morrison had been the one to document the evidence. That she had been the one to build the case. That she had been the source all along, and that Dr. Caldwell had tried to bury her because she was inconvenient, and then tried to destroy her because she was dangerous. Marcus Chen walked into the CEO's office carrying a laptop like it was a loaded weapon. He was a Marine Corps veteran, IT administrator, and the kind of precise person who backed up security footage before destroying it, not after. He opened the laptop. The screen projected onto the lobby wall, visible to anyone passing through the main corridor. The timestamp read 47 minutes after Katie collapsed. On the video, Dr. Caldwell stood over Katie's bleeding body on the ICU floor. His hands were in his pockets. His face was twisted into something that wasn't quite rage, it was something worse. Satisfaction. She's fired. Caldwell screamed at her unconscious form. You hear me? You're fired. The trauma team stood frozen. Nobody moved toward her. Nobody initiated treatment. Caldwell waved them away from Katie's body the way you'd wave away an insect. The video cut to another timestamp. 20 minutes later. Caldwell in an empty office with his phone to his ear. His voice on the recording was different now, controlled, vicious, methodical. I need her blacklisted. Every hospital from Seattle to San Francisco. I don't care how you do it. I want her name in every department, and I want them to know she violated a direct order and put a patient at risk. Make sure nobody touches her application. The CEO's face had gone the color of old bone. 2 FBI agents arrived with credentials and questions. They wanted to know about the security failures that allowed armed men into a cardiac ICU. They wanted to know who had authorized removing Colonel Hendricks' monitoring. They wanted to know about the timing between Katie being banned from his floor and the assassination attempt. They wanted to know whether Dr. Caldwell had any contact with individuals connected to the defense contract case, any unexplained deposits, any visits to Kandahar, any reason beyond professional jealousy to want a critical witness dead. Caldwell's lawyer arrived at 14:16 hours and told him to stop talking. The state medical board representative walked through the doors with a briefcase full of documented complaints. Families of patients Caldwell had deprioritized while attending to wealthy donors. Nurses he'd retaliated against for questioning his orders. Surgical errors that vanished from official records because Marcus Chen had learned to mirror every file before Caldwell could delete it. 3 years of data. 3 years of a predator in a white coat, and nobody in administration had checked his background closely enough to see what he really was. By 18:30 hours, the hospital had announced an emergency suspension of Caldwell's medical license pending investigation. By 9:15 the next morning, criminal negligence charges were filed, willful abandonment of a critical patient, destruction of evidence, retaliation against a federal witness. The state attorney general issued a press release that made it clear this was going to be a spectacle. Caldwell's colleagues didn't return his calls. His wife hired a divorce attorney. His references evaporated like morning mist. The hospital settled Katie's wrongful termination case within 48 hours. $14 million. They would have paid more just to make the story go away. But Katie Morrison wasn't the kind of person who made things go away. 6 months later, she stood in the main conference room of Seattle General in full Air Force dress blues, her Bronze Star and Purple Heart visible on her chest, the limp still there but her spine absolutely straight. Her hair was shorter than it used to be, a military cut, practical, the kind of cut you wear when you're not trying to prove anything to anyone. The hospital board announced her appointment as Director of Emergency Medicine. She accepted with one sentence, "I'll serve anyone who needs help, regardless of who they know." Her office overlooked the ER bay. On her desk, the dog tag on its broken chain, now in a small glass frame beside a photograph of Captain Derek Morrison in his flight suit, his smile exactly like hers. Every time she saved a life, she touched the frame once. A promise kept. A debt honored. A major who'd never stopped serving, even when the uniform came off. Dr. Caldwell worked the night security desk in the basement. It was part of his plea agreement. The alternative was 3 years in a federal penitentiary. 1,000 hours of community service at the hospital he once ran. He was no longer a doctor. He would never be a doctor again. The medical board had made that permanent. Every evening at 1800 hours, Katie passed his desk on her way to the parking garage. He never looked up. She never looked down. That wasn't cruelty. That was mercy. He got to keep his freedom. He just had to spend it knowing exactly what he'd lost. On her 6-month anniversary as director, a young nurse approached Katie in the hallway. The nurse was nervous, uncertain, exactly the way Katie had been 7 months ago. "Director Morrison," the nurse said quietly. I wanted to ask about a discharge order that doesn't seem right." Katie stopped. She turned. She saw herself standing in that hallway, saw the moment she'd learned that speaking up cost everything, saw the invisible weight of trying to do the right thing in a system built by people like Caldwell. "Tell me everything," Katie said. "If something's wrong, we fix it. That's the job." The nurse's face changed. Relief flooded through her features like someone had opened a door she didn't know existed. Later, in her office, Katie updated the staff training manual. The opening line was new, handwritten in her precise military script: "Power is not a title. Power is the ability to help." Through her window, she watched an ambulance arrive, red lights cutting through the evening. She was already moving toward the ER bay, limp barely slowing her down, ready to serve, ready to heal, ready to make sure that the next nurse who spoke up wouldn't have to pay the price. She was a major. She was home. And she was exactly where she needed to be. If you survived this story, click subscribe. Leave a comment and tell us, would you have stood up like Major Morrison did, or would you have kept your head down? Which choice would you have made?